Mohamed Al-Mubarak, explaining to Macron, of course, and then Jean-Luc Martinez is the director of the Louvre, standing behind, and even Mrs. Macron is looking with interest at the pottery. So, yeah. So some of the finds, the most famous find is, of course, the Marawah pot, which is from room 1 of that tripartite house. So Richard showed you pictures earlier. When we excavated the other rooms in the tripartite house, we found a lot of fish bones. This is, for example, in room 3, so going across, and as we lifted up some of the stones, I think John Martin is dancing for joy behind. Not quite sure why. But we have a lot of fish bones. These fish bones are being studied in Paris, actually. I have to mention Kevin Lidor, who's a PhD student in the Natural History Museum, who's a colleague of Marjan and Margareta Tengberg. And he's doing a great job going through them, and we're going to have a lot of interesting information. Following on, we also have some very interesting finds, interesting to compare with Sophie's. We have a Requiem shark tooth with a small hole drilled through it, very, very tiny Requiem shark, just a regular reef shark. But we also found pearl oyster buttons and quite a lot of black stone bangles. So some interesting finds, and these match things known from other sites, from Guain, from Jebel Buhais. We found some enigmatic things. In the room 2, so the middle room of the tripartite house, we found this dolphin jaw, and you can see it's a dolphin clearly from the sort of peg-shaped teeth, and it clearly has been carved. Someone was working with a tile knife, and clearly, actually, just nearby it, we found 2 flint tile knives. So it's interesting, but someone has clearly been doing something interesting with this. We found, notice the slight difference in the types of arrowheads we have here compared to the ones that Sophie showed. We have, especially these trihedral points are common, and we'll come back to those. These are some of the finds in room 2. We have a lot of shell beads, we have different bone tools and points and things. The bones are still under study. We find also quite a lot of plaster vessels. And if you can just see here carefully, this is actually like a plate, but made out of plaster. This is at the eastern end of room 3. I mentioned room 3 had quite a lot of fish bones and also mollusks remains in it, so it seems to be almost like a food consumption room. We also found in room 3, and this is really interesting, the plaster vessels are not just plain plaster vessels, but some of them have this painted decoration. So I was showing this to someone, and they said, this is the earliest expression of artistic endeavor in Abu Dhabi. It kind of is, actually. We don't have anything older with painting on it. It's a deliberate decorative style. So that's very interesting. We found a human burial in room 1 of the tripartite house, but it seemed to be inserted later. You'll notice it's actually right near one of the doorways, and it was rather disturbed somewhat, but it seems to be a later insertion. There was definite paving put in here at a higher level, so it seems to be a later use or abandonment phase of the building. These bones, this is Kaduma Al-Nuaimi from Abu Dhabi Police. We tried to, this is actually some of the more recent human bones that we actually scanned them. We went to Khalifa Hospital and did some CAT scanning. Just the condition of the bones is pretty horrible. So we were trying to get as much information as we could out of them, and it confirmed that it appears to be a male skeleton from the pelvis and from the mastoid feature of the skull, but they're very, very fragile, the bones, and difficult to deal with. We had a partial skeleton again in room 2, and again it's put on a deliberately paved area. So again, you have these deliberate stones placed in, and a burial. We found a bit of turtle carapace here. Of course, we know from Oman there's a tradition of turtles being buried with actually later period burials, but the condition of the bones, again, is not great. You have to consolidate them using paraloid, otherwise they completely just fall apart. But anyway, the full analysis still needs to be carried out on these. Notice our very recent excavations, just of 2 or 3 weeks ago, in the top of this mound, so above room 7, we found another human burial, and you can just see some of the bones coming through here. This was a deliberate grave cut into the top of the site. So yet again, burial, but in a later period of the site, a sort of abandonment phase or later phase. We found traces of 2 individuals in here, an adolescent of less than 14, 15 years old, because the femur and the tibia were both unfused, the epiphyseal ends, and a child, just a few bones of another individual, so 2 individuals in this grave. Richard already showed you this plan showing the things. Now, I hope, yes, the burial actually is inserted here. Do you see this red marks? So the burial cut, you can see it's actually cut into the top of the rubble on the site before we even got to and discovered this underlying wall. So it's a very late feature of the site. Now, the finds that we have, very interesting. We have you don't know how fantastic it is. If you do Neolithic period and you find arrowheads stratified in archaeological deposits, you don't realize how important it is, because 98% of material in our museums are just from surface finds, and this is really important, having these. So we have an interesting collection of barbed and tanged arrowheads, but especially we have mainly the trihedrals are the most common type, and we have an interesting variation. Most of them are these beautiful elongated trihedrals, but we have some quite short, stubby ones that seems to be almost like a local variant here. As you can see, of different colors, so they're not all made from local flint. Some of them are made from flint from the mainland and from further away. We also have some beautiful leaf-shaped points, and something very interesting on these, the condition of these and the preservation, because of having these arrowheads from buried, stratified contexts, it's really important. When you have things that are collected in the desert, have been rolling around for a long time, you don't have these fine details. Notice these notches. You see this pair of notches here and here and here and here? That seems to be for some form of hafting. Normally you don't have this detail surviving because the arrowheads have just been lying around, for centuries or millennia on the surface. We have a lot of tile knives, going back to the point that Stefan asked earlier about the camel site. We have tile knives found just within that site, just southeast of the camels. And tile knives are the ubiquitous butchery tools used, of course, in this area. So tile knives are the most common. They're used, of course, for butchering fish, for animals, for utilitarian tools. It's the most common tool. We also found some interesting, curious stone basins. This is quite a large stone. Notice the scale. This is actually 0.5 meter. And there's a deliberately carved sort of inlet in this stone, but then it's just flat on the other side. At first we got excited and thought, oh, it's an anchor or something like that, but I don't think it is an anchor, because it would be worn on the other side from the rope going through it. So it just seems to be a stone that has a sort of libation hole or whatever in it. As you know, there are temples and things like this where you find such things. There's also a stone here that seems to be just used as a kind of mortar. So it's interesting. We're starting to find traces of interesting things. This is Abdullah Al-Karbi, and he was very happy because it was the small find number 1000 in our register. He found it, so he was excited. Unfortunately, he's on military service at the moment. He so wanted to be here at this conference. But it was actually a very nice, the 1000th find from the site was this glorious steatite bead. This season was mainly about elucidating the plans of the buildings, and so it was a lot of detailed documentation. It's really quite amazing, this building. What we did find during the excavations of Room 5 was a pearl, which has recently been filmed by the TV for the new series History of the UAE, which is coming out. Now, of course, we had to have an idea about dating of this site. As Sophie Mary showed you, the Gwain site is very important because that was the site that was the earliest known pearls from the UAE until now. So we have that first pearl, and then we found 2 more pearls in the recent excavations. So we have three now in total now. But what about the dating of these? Well, we're very lucky because these pearls, the first pearl came from room 5, from right down at the bottom of the bedrock. We were able to do a whole series of radiocarbon dates for these. Oh, hang on. This is a heat map of special finds. This is just to show you where we have found by special finds. It means things like plaster vessels and things so far. So you can see that the majority of the interesting finds we've had so far are within this main structure, but we're still in a very, very high level. These are showing there's some interesting patterns in some of this data. So plaster vessels are only found in green in this main structures, for example, and then some of the other finds are outside. Now, just to conclude, this is a bit small here, but the radiocarbon dates show now that this site dates back to 5,800 Cal BC, so we're in a range of between 5.6 to 5.8. We have some later period dates, but all our most recent dates that come from room 5 are incredibly old. So this is not only the earliest site in the UAE with stone architecture, it also means that our pearl, which falls in between 3 of these samples, is in a range considerably older than the Gwain one. And just provisional reconstruction, this is not exactly my reconstruction, it's done by the TV people for the new history of the UAE. I'm not sure it's quite right for the tripartite house. They did this before we discovered our new building, so we'll have to go back to square one. But the idea of corbelled stone igloos kind of joined together is somewhat attractive. And of course it was greener in the early Neolithic because we have more optimal weather in that time. And just like to conclude by thanking the whole team. They all worked incredibly hard this year. It was tough. We moved tons and tons of stones, and we still have tons of stones to move. But I think the next season we'll be doing will be very, very exciting. You've seen the potential just from the surface material, and what we've mapped on the distribution of finds indicates that this is really super, super special site, changing our ideas actually about the early Neolithic period, because this remarkable architecture, remarkable finds, we have to actually rethink, and as conversations with Peter, it is, we would say, a game changer in our understanding of the early Neolithic period in UAE. Thank you.